McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 2, Chapter 4, The Visual Elements. Chapter outline: line, shape, and mass, light, color, texture and pattern, space, time, and motion. Line. Outlines define the edges of two-dimensional shapes. Strictly defined, a line is a path traced by a moving point. You pose your pencil on a sheet of paper and move its point along the surface to make a line. Yet lines are not confined to scribbling on a page. Some can reach immense proportions. The gigantic earth drawings, known as Nazak lines, are just that, lines. They are the work of the Nazak people of South Peru. Created sometime in the first millennium, the lines were made by removing the top layer of weathered stones from the desert floor. The exposed sand is lighter in color. Some of the drawings are long, straight lines up to 30 miles long. Others are geometric patterns, animals, plants, and human-like forms. These lines, seen here, seem to define the shape of a hummingbird in flight. The feathers and the beak are formed perfectly by parallel lines that come together at the end. The hummingbird's extended neck and beak and outstretched wings seem to lead it forward, yet this implied motion, like the rest of the bird, can be seen completely only from the sky, leading experts to wonder how the drawings were used. Such immense drawings would have taken many people and a long time to create. Whatever their meaning, these lines are in the Peruvian desert clearly meant a great deal to the Nazak people who made them. Line. Contour lines define the edges of three-dimensional shapes. Strictly speaking, an outline defines a two-dimensional shape, like the Nazak lines. For example, drawing with chalk on a blackboard, you might outline the shape of your home state. On a dress pattern, dotted lines outline the shapes of various pieces, but if you were to make the dress and then draw someone wearing it, you would be drawing the dress's contours. Contours are the boundaries we perceive of three-dimensional forms, and contour lines are the lines we draw to record those boundaries. Jacques Chalat used pen and ink to make a contour line drawing of a horse. We see the edges of the horse's legs and hindquarters, shoulders, neck, and head. Chalet even used contour lines to define boundaries of the tail and the mane. Strictly speaking, an outline defines a two-dimensional shape, like the Nazak lines. For example, drawing with chalk on a blackboard, you might outline the shape of your home state. On a dress pattern, dotted lines outline the shapes of various pieces. But if you were to make that dress and then draw someone wearing it, you would be drawing the dress's contour lines. Contours are the boundaries we perceive of a three-dimensional form, and contour lines are the lines we use to draw and record those boundaries. Jacques Chalat used pen and ink to make contour line drawings of a horse. We see the edges of the horse's legs, hindquarters, shoulders, neck, and head. We see that the artist even used contour lines to define the boundaries of the tail and the mane. Line. Lines direct our attention in works of art. Lines direct our attention in works of art. Our eyes tend to follow lines to see where they are going, like a train follows a track. Artists can use this tendency to direct our eyes around a work and to suggest movement. British artist John Constable's Yarmouth Getty illustrates the power of line to direct our eyes. The horizon, where the sea meets the sky, forms a long line that divides the image into upper and lower portions. The dark jetty reinforces this horizon line and carries it to the far left side of the canvas, where there are small buildings. The line where the sand meets the water creates a diagonal that rises from the lower right corner to meet the horizon. This diagonal line also directs our attention to the buildings and to the activity at the end of the jetty. These two strong lines guide our experience of the painting. Line. Lines create movement and energy in works of art. In addition to structuring the viewing experience, Line can also provide dramatic emotional energy. The theme of Peter Paul Rubens' Raising of the Cross is the moment when the cross-bound Christ is hoisted upright. Rubens imagined this work done by large muscular men. As they pulled the cross, their bodies, Christ's body, and the cross itself from a large diagonal line that runs from the bottom right corner of the painting to the top left. This main diagonal is repeated at a slightly different angle by another, consisting of the rope and the pulling man farthest right. These lines intersect another diagonal made of legs and backs on the left side. These secondary lines seem to push the main diagonal toward the viewer. The only vertical line in the painting are the figures of the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist to the left side. Their vertical figures quietly assert their significance and pain within the melee of the Christ execution. Lines create movement and energy in works of art. Line. Implied lines in art are made by a series of unconnected points that we connect into lines. In addition to actual lines, lines formed by edges and linear forms like the moving bodies in Rubens' paintings, our eyes also pick up on lines that are only implied. A common example from everyday life would be a dotted line, where a series of dots are spaced closely enough together that our minds make the connections between them. In the 18th century, a French painter named Jean-Antoinette Watteau created a sort of dotted line of an amorous couple in this painting. Starting with the seated couple at the right, we can trace a line that curves in a subtle S that leaves us evaporating into the gauzy air with infant cupids. Implied lines in art are made by a series of unconnected points that we connect into lines. Shape and mass. Artists use positive and negative shapes to create two-dimensional art. Artists use positive and negative shapes to create space in two-dimensional art. A shape is a two-dimensional form, and any two-dimensional image is a system of interlocking shapes. Each shape within the image occupies an area with identifiable boundaries. Boundaries may be created by line or by a shift in texture or color. A mass is a three-dimensional form that occupies a volume of space. We speak of a mass of clay, the mass of a mountain, the masses of a work of architecture. Shapes and masses can be divided into two broad categories, geometric and organic. Geometric shapes and masses approximate the regular named shapes and volumes of geometry, such as a square, triangle, circle, cube, pyramid, sphere. Organic shapes and masses are irregular and invoke the living forms of nature. In Rosabella Cataria's portrait of Gustav Hamilton, this two-dimensional work, which was painted while the young Irishman visited Venice, Hamilton dressed for the Venice Carnival, with a mask pushed off to the side of his head. His whole figure makes a large triangle with its apex at the top of the hat. The painting also defines other shapes within the figure with changes in color. For example, the boundary of the triangular shape of Hamilton's right side is visible where the blue coat meets the black headscarf and fur collar. Caria also used texture to distinguish shapes. The triangle area of the white linen shirt is bordered by the fur of the collar and the lace of the headscarf. The whole figure creates a roughly triangular shape. This is known as a positive shape. But there is another shape in this image. It is the gray arching area of the background surrounding the figure. In fact, any shape created on a limited two-dimensional surface creates a second shape, a complementary shape, which is known as a negative shape. There are several shapes in Jesus Boesta Morolas monument granite sculpture spiral disc. We see the positive shape of a circle at the top. The square hole in the middle creates a negative shape. For Morolas, the negative shape was just as important as the positive circle. The tall pyramid that holds up the disc has a thickness to it. It takes up space, as does the round base that the sculpture rests on. These thicker stones remind us that this whole sculpture is three-dimensional and has mass. To fully appreciate the mass and know how much space it occupies, we would have to walk around the sculpture in person or view it on a video being slowly circled. As visitors walk around, they can look through the negative space of the open square that provides a frame but shifting views of the sculpture garden's location. Space and mass. Three-dimensional forms are made of masses that occupy space. Three-dimensional forms are made of masses that occupy space. Space and mass. In art, the main shapes are the figures and the surroundings are the grounds. In art, the main shapes are the figures and the surroundings are the grounds. We perceive shapes by mentally detaching them from their surroundings and recognizing them as distinct and coherent. We refer to this relationship as figure and ground. A figure is the shape we detach and focus on. The ground is the surrounding visual information that the figure stands out from, or the background. In Gustav Hamilton, the figure is Hamilton's body and clothing, while the ground is the gray background behind him. On the picture by an artist of the ancestral Pueblo people of American Southwest, however, the distinction between figure and ground, or positive and negative shapes, is not so clear. Covering the vessel are lines that end in triangular shapes. Over much of the picture, the lines are clearly black drawn on white ground. But things get confused when we reach the center. While we may initially see black lines ending in black triangles, it is just as easy to reverse this perception and to see white lines ending in white triangles. This play of figure and ground, or positive and negative, brings the surface to life and makes the picture more engaging. Shape and mass. We perceive implied shapes in art by the arrangement of lines, shapes, and/or masses. We perceive implied shapes in art by the arrangement of lines, shapes, and/or masses. We perceive implied shapes in art by the arrangement of lines, shapes, and/or masses. In this diagram, we see 3 black circles, each with a wedge taken out. But the very first thing that most of us see is a floating white triangle. Our mind instantly perceives the visual information as a whole, even though that whole does not exist. This is called reification, when we do not need to see the whole of a thing for our minds to fill in the gaps. Reification is one of the principles of Gestalt theory, which explains that lines of each wedge and their position in relation to one another causes us to see the triangle formed of the negative space at the center. Through optical puzzles such as this triangle, psychology provided a scientific explanation for something that artists had been doing intuitively for centuries, using implied shapes to unify their works. In the Madonna of the Meadows, Raphael has grouped the figures of Mary, the young John the Baptist, and the young Jesus Christ, so that we perceive them as singular, a triangular whole. Mary's head defines the apex, and John the Baptist the lower left corner. Defining the lower right corner is Mary's exposed foot, which draws our attention because of the way the pale flesh contrasts with the darker tones around it. Just as artists use implied lines to help direct our view around the composition, Raphael uses this implied shape to create a sense of order so that we perceive the composition as unified and harmonious. Light. Art uses real and implied light and shadow. Light is a key visual element in works of art. When we talk about light in art, we refer both to real light and the representation of light. Represented light is implied light created as part of a work of art, and it plays several roles. Light is represented in works of two-dimensional art to define and describe the figures in space. The Spanish painter Joaquin Sorolla has been called the painter of light. His luminous Boys on the Beach painting shows his mastery of representing light using paint. The painting pictures three boys lying on the wet sand while the seawater swirls around them. Sorolla depicted different aspects of representing light. Note how each boy's reflection appears beside him to imply the presence of light reflecting on the wet sand. Light also creates reflections on the boys' bodies. Sorolla used small patches of white paint to simulate the glare of light reflecting off of wet skin. These white patches all appear on the boys' left sides because Sorolla wanted us to see that they all share the same light and the same sun, which is above and to the right of the painting. The light from the sun creates the shadows under the boys' heads, and these shadows fall opposite the sun. Light. Real light and its related shadow effects in three-dimensional works. Real light and its related shadow cast effects in three-dimensional works. When we talk about light in art, we refer to both real light and the representation of light. Real light refers to how an object interacts with light in its environment. At Sainte-Chapelle, natural sunlight passes through the colored stained glass windows to create a dramatic jewel-like effect. Real light and its related shadow create effects in three-dimensional works. Light. Implied or represented light in two-dimensional art defines shapes and spaces. Implied or represented light in two-dimensional art defines shapes and spaces. Light. Modeling with different values of light and shadow creates the illusion of three-dimensional form in two-dimensional art. Modeling with different values of light and shadow creates the illusion of three-dimensional forms, as we see in this piece entitled Sharecropper. The light and shadow reveal the masses of the woman's body. We can see the roundness of her neck, her projecting nose and cheekbones, and her sunken cheeks. Our experience in the world tells us that three-dimensional objects are highlighted where they are closest to the light, and then increasingly shaded as they move away from the light. Therefore, the figure in Catelet's painting, or print, represented here, must also have mass and bulk. Modeling with different values of light and shadow creates the illusion of three-dimensional form, as is seen in this painting by Caravaggio. Caravaggio was a master of chiaroscuro and contrasted the bright highlights with dark shadows, as if his paintings took place underneath the spotlights of his theater stage. We see the contrast in value most clearly in Christ's face, seated at the center of the table. Christ's right side is exposed to an unseen light source, his forehead closest to the light while almost white. His left cheek, on the other hand, is in deep shadow with a much darker value, and his neck below has disappeared into the darkness. The same stark contrast of light and dark value makes the man with outstretched arms on the right seem to project forward. He embodies the drama and emotion of what we are supposed to feel while looking at a Caravaggio painting, as if Christ miraculously appeared to us in a darkened dining room. Color. Color is reflected light, characterized by hues with value and intensity. It's probably safe to say that none of the visual elements gives as much pleasure as color. Much of our present-day color theory can be traced back to experiments made by Sir Isaac Newton, who is better known for his work with the laws of gravity. In 1666, Newton passed a ray of sunlight through a prism, a transparent glass form with non-parallel sides. He observed that the ray of sunlight broke up or refracted into different colors, which were arranged in the order of the colors of the rainbow. By setting up a second prism, Newton found that he could recombine the rainbow colors into white light, like the original sunlight. These experiments proved that colors are actually components of light. Color is reflected light characterized by hue with value and intensity. Color is reflected light characterized by hues with value and intensity. These are the properties of color: hue, value, and intensity. Hue is the name of a color according to the categories on the color wheel, while value refers to the relative lightness or darkness of a color, and intensity refers to the brightness or dullness of a color. Color. The color wheel consists of primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, both warm and cool. The color wheel consists of primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, both warm and cool. Primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, are labeled with the numeral 1 on the color wheel. They are called primary because, theoretically at least, they cannot be made by any mixture of other colors. Secondary colors, orange, green, and violet, are labeled with the numeral 2. Each is made by combining two primary colors. Intermediate colors, also known as tertiary colors, labeled number 3, are the product of a primary color and an adjacent secondary color. For instance, mixing yellow with green yields a yellowish green. This kind of mixing takes place in the painting palette. A palette refers to a wooden board on which artists traditionally set out to combine their pigments, but it can also refer to the range of pigments that they selected. We speak of colors on the orange and red side of the wheel as warm colors, perhaps because of their association with sunlight and firelight. The colors on the blue-green side are considered cool colors, and again, this is probably because of their association with sky, water, shade, and so on. Color. Artists select color palettes and harmonies for visual and expressive effects. The Iranian coronation carpet shown here has a warm palette in the center and a cool palette on the surrounding border. The Dene or Navajo weaver of this diamond patterned blanket rug uses primary hues of red and yellow as the dominant colors. 3 different values of red appear, from lighter orange-red tint to darker ruby red shade. These saturated warm reds appear to pop out of the rug. The other hues are less saturated. For example, the tones of yellow we see next to the reds have a lower intensity, with the addition of gray or violet on the opposite side of the color wheel. Artists select color palettes and harmonies for visual and expressive effect. In Vermeer's painting, he had calmness in mind when he chose the blue hues that dominate his painting, Young Woman with a Water Pitcher. The different hues and values of blue are cool and create a quiet mood. Blue contributes significantly to the subdued feeling of the painting, although it does not create it alone. The filtered bluish light that comes in through the window and the woman's slow movement evoke the viewer's memories of tranquil mornings at home, and these elements also play a role in the emotional temperature of a piece of work. Edvard Munch's harrowing painting The Scream uses color for a very different expressive effect. As he wrote in his diary, "It was a time when life had ripped my soul open." Munch uses red to express horror, blood, and anguish. But how, outside of his diary, are we to know that Munch did not intend to simply depict a splendid sunset? As with Vermeer's domestic scene, color does not carry the entire expressive burden by itself. Whereas Vermeer's painting is characterized by soft light and slow pace, here unstable diagonals and swirling lines dominate. The line of the horizon is almost obliterated. The figure at the front of the painting, called the foreground, clasps its hands over his ears. His head has become a death's head. His body wavers unsteadily. In contrast, the 2 pedestrians in the back remain unaffected. Evidently, they hear nothing out of the ordinary. The scream is a silent one, the interior cry of a soul projected into nature. Color. Color schemes or harmonies can be monochromatic, complementary, or analogous. A color harmony or a color scheme is a selective use of two or more colors in a single composition. Color schemes or harmonies can be monochromatic, complementary, or analogous. Monochromatic harmonies are composed of variations on the same hue, often with differences in value and intensity. A painting all in red, pinks, and maroons would be considered to have a monochromatic harmony. Artists use monochromatic color schemes to focus attention away from color to other elements within the work. In other cases, a monochromatic palette is understood to appear tranquil or spiritual. In Cantor by Emily Whitehorse, the work shown here, mainly she's using tints and shades of blue in her interpretation of symbols found in Navajo or Dene rock art. Notice how this is mostly a blue painting, and it makes the red element at the bottom stand out. Analogous harmonies combine colors adjacent to one another on the color wheel, as in this Lures Comforts Tiffany Magnolias and Iris, which moves from light blues to greens to deep violets. The analogous colors of the window, which was designed for a mausoleum, create a calm, introspective feeling for mourners, as cool colors are thought to have a calming effect. Color. Perception of colors relies on functions of the eye, including optical color mixture. The optical effects of color. Perception of colors relies on the functions of eyes, including optical color mixture. When small patches of different colors are close together, the eye may blend them to produce a new color. This is called optical color mixture, and it is an important feature of the painting of George Seurat. Rather than blending his colors on a palette or on his canvas to produce a gradation of hue, Seurat placed many thousands of tiny dots or points of pure color next to each other, a process that came to be called pointillism. From a distance of a few inches, a painting such as this one appears to be nothing but a jumble of colored dots. The skirt on the standing woman at the far right is made up of blue, yellow-orange, black, and white dots. The skin of her arms has the same colors, just in different concentrations. As the viewer steps back, however, the dots gradually coalesce into a dark blue-gray skirt and a flesh-toned arm. Texture and pattern. Artists use actual texture to engage the senses, especially in three-dimensional art. Artists use actual texture to engage the senses, especially in three-dimensional art. Actual texture is literally tactile, a quality we can experience through touch. It would be a pleasure to run our hands along the smooth industrial surface around the perimeter of this piece by Mona Hatem. But anyone who has ever scraped their knuckles on a kitchen grater would be very careful about exploring the rough texture of the two central fields. Dormente is an Italian word for a sleeping person. The title asks us to imagine a large-scale grater as a bed, thus encouraging us to contemplate the exact experience we would rather not consider, the intimate contact of our vulnerable flesh with its jagged metal points. The artist says, "In my work, I often take familiar everyday things and make them unfamiliar to reveal the uncanniness in them. It's like when something is simultaneously attractive and forbidding, but both seductive and dangerous." Like any other visual element, texture can contribute to our understanding and interpretation of a work. The Mexican coconut shell cup shown here brings together two distinct materials, coconut shell and silver. The artist carved small flowers into the polished shell, but left the roughed areas behind for the contrast in textures. The silver handles and base provide a smooth and hard texture. Bringing these disparate materials and their textures together not only provides visual interest, but also meaning. The textures are a reminder of the meeting of the Europeans and other civilizations through exploration and colonization. The coconut shell represents Asia or the Americas, while the silver symbolized European culture. Texture and pattern. Artists create implied texture to remind viewers of real texture. Artists create implied texture to remind viewers of real textures. Naturalistic painting can suggest the texture of objects in the world in the same way that photography does, by faithfully recording the way light plays over their surfaces. In the years before photography was widely available, still life painters delighted in capturing visual texture in paint. American painter William Hartnett was part of a group of painters who were so skilled in this simulating what the eye can see that their works came to be known as trompe-l'oeil paintings. Trompe-l'oeil is French for "it fools the eye." Texture and pattern. Patterns in art flatten space and mass. Pattern in art flattens space and mass. Pattern is any decorative, repetitive motif or design. Pattern can create visual texture, although visual texture, like the rest on Hartnett's lock, may not always be seen as pattern. An interesting aspect of pattern is that it tends to flatten our perception of mass and space, such as in this painting by Klimt. The kiss illustrates pattern's flattening effect. The two figures are painted like an illusion. Klimt uses light and shadow to model their flesh, even just barely. Roundness of the woman's ankle is noticeable because of its highlight that runs down the center and the soft bluish shadows at the sides. The rest of the painting looks completely flat. It is covered in a variety of repetitive patterns, speckled gold in the background, rectangles and circles covering the bodies, colorful flowers at the bottom. It is as if the slightly rounded bodies of the kissing couple emerge from a flattened universe of color and pattern, creating a visual tension that abstracts the image and makes it unrecognizable in our world. Space. Space in art can be real or implied. Space in art can be real or implied. Anish Kapoor's sculpture, Cloud Gate, occupies a lot of space. Located in a park in Chicago, the polished steel sculpture is more than 65 feet wide and rises more than 30 feet in the air. This mass, inspired by liquid mercury, exists in three-dimensional space, just as its viewers do. Walking around and under the sculpture reminds us of the space the sculpture is taking up and the space we share with that. We are also reminded of the real space where the sculpture is by looking at the reflections on the polished surface. The sculpture interacts with this space as we see ourselves, the landscape, and the Chicago skyline reflected back to us, extending the sculpture's space far beyond the park it occupies. Space in art can be real or implied. Like sculpture, architecture takes up space, but it also shapes it. Without the walls and ceilings of a room, space would be limitless. With them, space suddenly has boundaries, and therefore volume. Whereas from the outside we appreciate a work of architecture for its sculptural mass, from the inside we experience it as a shaped space or a sequence of shaped spaces. Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, helps us to see how architecture constructs spaces. There are no vertical walls and flat ceilings to create a box of an interior space here. Instead, Gehry molds and complicates the space. The main volume in the middle of the photograph swells and blends to follow the lines of the building. Some spaces are concave and some convex. Each of the openings, a balcony, a passageway, a staircase, fragments the space and provides a different perspective on it and invites us to explore a new area. Quantities and dimensions of space can be implied in two-dimensional art. For example, if you take an ordinary notebook page and draw a tiny dog in the center, the page has suddenly become a large space. a field for the dog to roam in and about. If you draw a dog that takes up the entire page, the page has become a much smaller space, just big enough for the dog. Suppose now that you draw two dogs and perhaps a tree, and you want to show where they are in relation to one another. One dog is behind the tree, say, and the other is running toward it from the distance. In the real world, these relationships would take place in the third dimension, or in depth. There are many visual cues that we use to perceive spatial relationships in depth. One of the simplest is overlapping. We understand that when two forms overlap, the one we see in front is closer to us than the one behind. A second visual cue is position. Seated at a desk, for example, we look down to see the objects closest to us and raise our head to see the objects that are far away. Many artistic cultures have relied entirely on those two basic cues to imply depth in two-dimensional art. In this lively scene of an Indian princess entertainment, spatial distance is communicated by location on the page and by overlapping. We understand that the performers towards the bottom are nearer to us than those farther up the page. The overlapping elephants and horses standing next to each other appear as a row that recedes from us. The most important person in the scene is the prince sitting among his courtiers and attendants who all look at him. This group is high on the painting's field to show that they are farther away from us than the acrobats. Space in art can be real or implied. In this piece by Leonardo da Vinci, The Last Supper, Leonardo da Vinci is using overlapping and placement to communicate implied space, and he is also using linear perspective. Space. Three-dimensional works engage the space around them. Three-dimensional works engage the space around them. Space. Architecture engages the space around it and shapes the interior spaces. Architecture engages the space around it and shapes interior spaces. Space. Two-dimensional art can suggest three-dimensional space. Two-dimensional art can suggest three-dimensional space. Two-dimensional art can suggest three-dimensional space. One of the ways that it does this is through linear perspective, as seen here. Two-dimensional art can suggest three-dimensional space, and one of the ways that it does this is through linear perspective. Just as artists took note of the optical evidence of light and shadow to model rounded forms using the technique called chiaroscuro, they also developed a technique for constructing an optically convincing space to set those forms in. This technique is called linear perspective, and it is based on the systematic application of two observations. One, forms seem to diminish in size as they recede from us, and two, parallel lines receding into the distance seem to converge until they meet at a point on the horizon line where they disappear. This point is known as the vanishing point. Da Vinci used linear perspective to construct space for the Last Supper. Painted on a monastery wall in Milan, the Last Supper depicts the final gathering of Jesus Christ with his disciples, the Passover meal they shared before Jesus was brought to trial and crucified. Leonardo chose a particular moment in the story as related to the Gospel of Matthew and the Bible. Jesus, shown at the center of the composition, has just said to his followers, "One of you shall betray me." The disciples, Matthew tells us, "We are exceedingly sorrowful," and began every one of them to say unto him, "Lord, is it I?" But the traitor Judas, seated forth from the left, with his elbow on the table, leans away from Jesus and clutches a bag containing 30 pieces of silver, his price for handing over Jesus to the authorities. The space Leonardo constructed in the painting opens before us like a theater stage. All of the banquet hall's parallel lines seem to converge at the painting's center. This, including the lines of the ceiling panels and the lines where the walls meet the ceiling and the implied lines running atop the cloth hangings on either wall. The spatial recession that these lines suggest gives the figures modeled in chiaroscuro a logical space to occupy. Yet Leonardo also used linear perspective to communicate the meanings of the painting. If we trace all of those receding lines to where they merge, we would find Jesus Christ's head in front of the distant vanishing point on the horizon. Thus, our attention is directed forcefully toward the most important part of the composition, the face of Jesus. Space element. Arrangement of figures on the picture plane can suggest three-dimensional space. Arrangements of figures on the picture plane can suggest three-dimensional space. Space. Linear perspective in two-dimensional art creates the illusion of three-dimensional space. Linear perspective in two-dimensional art creates the illusion of three-dimensional space, as is seen here in Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper. Space. Foreshortening in two-dimensional art creates the illusion that objects project forward or backward into space. Foreshortening in two-dimensional art creates the illusion that objects project forward or backward into space. For pictorial space to be consistent, the logic of linear perspective must apply to every form that recedes into the distance, including objects in humans and animal forms. This effect is called foreshortening. Space. Atmospheric perspective in two-dimensional art creates the illusion of distance through haziness and muted colors. Atmospheric perspective in two-dimensional art creates the illusion of distance through haziness and muted colors, as we can see in this work by John Frederick Kinset. Staring off into a series of hills, you may notice that each receding range appears paler, bluer, and less distinct. This is an optical effect caused by the atmosphere that interposes itself between us and the objects that we perceive. Particles of moisture and dust suspended in the atmosphere shatter light. All of the colors of the spectrum. Blue shatters the most, hence the sky itself appears to be blue, and things take on a bluish tinge as their distance increases from us. The first European artist to apply this observation systematically was Leonardo da Vinci, who called this effect aerial perspective. A more common term today is atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective in two-dimensional art creates the illusion of distance through haziness and muted colors, as is seen in this work by Huayan, Conversations in Autumn from 1732. The trees and the rocks in the foreground are painted in dark strokes of ink. We can clearly see the leaves on the trees, the cracks and the crevices in the rocks, and the architectural details of the huts where the two figures sit, lost in conversation. A poem written on the painting in Chinese calligraphy explains that they are discussing the sounds of autumn. As our eyes move into the background, the ink gets paler and the details less distinct. We can see that the tallest peak of the background is covered in vegetation, but we cannot make out the individual plants. By the time our eyes reach the furthest mountain, all detail is gone and replaced with a wash of pale gray ink that helps us to sense that it is in the distance. Space. Isometric perspective in two-dimensional art creates the illusion of distance using diagonal parallel lines. Isometric perspective in two-dimensional art creates the illusion of distance using diagonal parallel lines. In the page illustrated here from the manuscript of the Kahem-Saha, the poet Ganjavi, the canopy over the seated figure is portrayed using isometric perspective. The sides recede to the right in parallel diagonal lines. The rear edge is wide as the side nearest to us. The painting pictures the ancient Greek king Alexander the Great enthroned at the palace of Persepolis in Iran. Alexander conquered much of the territory between Greece and India during his 13-year reign. He spent several months at Persepolis celebrating his defeat of the Parisians, who had once sacked the Greek city of Athens. From his throne, Alexander appears here receiving Parisian courtiers and being cared for by their servants. Space. Different cultures have different conventions for representing space. Different cultures can have different conventions for representing space. Different cultures can have different conventions for representing space. As you look at this painting by the Italian painter Da Vinci, what conventions do you see for representing space? And how does that contrast with some of the other examples we've seen? Contrast this work with the work we just viewed. What conventions are used here to represent space? Different cultures have different conventions for representing space. Use this work by Hugh Yan in Conversation with Autumn, 1732, in contrast to The Last Supper. How are the conventions different for representing space? And contrasting this work with the two works before, contrast how the different cultures represent space differently. Time and motion. The passage of time in art can be real or implied. Time and motion in art. Time and motion are always linked together in art because motion unfolds over time. Time and motion can be either represented in art or it can be real, actual time and motion that passes in a work of art. The passage of time in art can be real or implied. As in this work, time is implied. We see the Virgin Mary in the center and also off to the side, implying that there is a story, a passage of time, different events that the Virgin has been through with a certain person or group of people. The passage of time can be seen here in Robert Capa's photograph. Capa was a photojournalist in World War II, documenting the fightings for newspapers and magazines that published his pictures. On June 6, 1944, he boarded a landing craft and joined the first wave of U.S. forces storming the beach at Normandy in France. Omaha Beach, as Allied commanders named the landing zone, was heavily fortified with German machine gun firings down on the soldiers. By the end of the invasion's first day, more than 2,000 Allied soldiers had died, many never making it onto dry land. Capa's fleeting scene of this D-Day invasion pictures ocean, shoulders, and defense barriers. All appear blurry to us because of the chaos that reigned. The photographer's hand shook, the soldiers charged towards the beach, and the ocean rose and fell. There was no opportunity to focus the camera lens or hold everything still as Capa took the picture. Life was moving fast, and Capa's photographs help us to feel the motion and the sense of the soldiers' fear and anxiety and adrenaline. The image also freezes time and halts motion to present a fraction of the freezed moment in a single blurry frame. In this work by Jean Tinguely, the passage of time is real and implied. The machine here, or sculpture, actually moves, meaning it is kinetic art. And so through motion, it records time. The motion of the sculpture actually draws onto the sheet of sketch paper, recording the motion of the machine. So as we can see, when the machine is moving, we experience the real passage of time, and when it is not moving, we experience the implied passage of time. Time and motion. Continuous narrative communicates the passage of time. Continuous narrative communicates the passage of time. Time and motion. Kinetic art moves by natural or mechanical means. Kinetic art moves by natural or mechanical means. And that concludes Chapter 4.